In 1555, a printer named Mace Bonhomme stood in his shop in Lyon, France, holding a freshly pressed sheet of paper. It smelled of wet ink, metallic type, and the damp wood of the press. He was looking at a specific four-line stanza written by a local apothecary, a man who would later become infamous. The stanza stated that at the 48th climacteric degree at the exact end of Cancer, there would be a very great dryness. It stated that fish in the sea, the river, and the lake would be boiled hectic. It stated that Béarn and Bigorre would be in distress through fire from the sky. For 471 years, historians and skeptics read those lines and dismissed them as poetic exaggeration. They said it was just metaphorical language for political turmoil, or perhaps a slight exaggeration of a localized drought, because the sea does not boil. The ocean is too vast, too deep, too cold to ever reach a temperature that could cook the life inside it. But this July, in the Mediterranean, the water temperature crossed 30 degrees Celsius. Firefighters in France and Italy died trying to stop the forests from burning, and thousands of dead fish washed up on the beaches, literally cooked in the shallow coastal waters. What he wrote was not a metaphor. It was a precise, geographically anchored weather report from the future. To truly understand the weight of this, you have to understand what it meant to publish a book in 1555. Mace Bonhomme was not just a printer. He was a gatekeeper of knowledge in a time when knowledge could get you killed. The printing press was a noisy, physically demanding machine. The ink was made from soot and varnish, thick and pungent. Every single letter had to be set by hand, backward, into a composing stick. A mistake meant resetting an entire page. So when the apothecary brought him the manuscript for Les Prophéties, Bonhomme had to make a calculated decision. He was dedicating expensive paper and countless hours of labor to a text that was strange, cryptic, and potentially dangerous. The fact that he printed it, that he immortalized the 48th degree and the boiling fish, means that even then the text carried a weight, a strange authority that compelled him to act. Before we continue, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. This is incredibly important for the YouTube algorithm to understand that this kind of research has value. And it is the only way I can keep digging through these historical archives, connecting the dots, and bringing you these direct connections that most people miss in their daily news feeds. My name is Roger Kessler. For 22 years, I worked as a reference librarian in Springfield, Missouri. My entire professional life was spent in the basement of the public library, managing the local newspaper archives and the microfilm collections. When you spend 2 decades staring at historical records, looking for the exact spelling of a name, the precise date of a forgotten event, or the lost context of a historical anomaly, you learn one very important rule. You never accept a quote or a claim without checking the original edition. You verify the date. You verify the exact wording, because human memory is flawed. And history gets distorted by people who want to sell you a convenient narrative. Today, I maintain my own private database. I spend my days cross-referencing historical prophetic texts with real-time disaster feeds from agencies like the United States Geological Survey, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Global Disaster Alert and Coordination System. And right now, the numbers coming out of Europe are flashing red on my screens. We have been watching a massive heat dome over the United States, which I talked about in a previous investigation, but what is happening across the Atlantic is a synchronized continental crisis that demands our immediate attention. And consider my perspective down in that library basement in Missouri. The microfilm readers hummed a low, constant vibration. The acetate film smelled slightly like vinegar as it degraded. I spent years threading those films, scanning through forgotten local disasters, floods that washed away entire towns, heat waves that buckled train tracks. I learned that catastrophe always leaves a paper trail. It always has a precursor. But what I am seeing now, tracking the global disaster alert feeds, is different. It is not localized. It is systemic. The European heat crisis is not just a weather event. It is a structural failure of the atmospheric system. The heat dome that settled over the Mediterranean acts like a physical lid, trapping the hot air and compressing it, forcing the temperature higher and higher with each passing day. I remember one specific afternoon in the library. I was reading a microfilm reel from the summer of 1936, the peak of the American Dust Bowl. The descriptions of the heat were visceral. People wrapping themselves in wet sheets just to survive the night, birds dropping dead from the sky. I thought I was reading about a historical anomaly, a singular tragedy that could never be repeated. But as I sit here now, watching the Eurostat data update in real time, I realize that 1936 was just a prologue. What is happening in Europe is the main event. The scale is entirely different. We are not talking about a rural farming crisis. We are talking about the complete failure of urban infrastructure across multiple modernized nations, all happening simultaneously beneath a stagnant mass of superheated air. I sit here in Springfield, Missouri, miles away from any ocean, surrounded by server racks and monitors watching the data stream in. I see the heat maps glowing purple and black over the Mediterranean basin. It is deeply unsettling. You see, the official version of history, the one you find in textbooks and university lectures, treats ancient prophecies as psychological coping mechanisms. Stéphane Gerson, a professor of French studies at New York University, wrote a brilliant book analyzing how Renaissance anxieties shaped these texts. He argued that modern societies project their own contemporary climate fears onto these cryptic old writings. The scholarly consensus is that 16th century writers were just experiencing cyclical droughts and describing them with apocalyptic language. The official version tells us not to look for modern coordinates in ancient poems. It tells us that looking for literal meaning in Renaissance astrology is a fool's errand. And for a long time, that official version felt solid. It felt rational. It made sense to assume that a man in 1555 was just writing about his own local weather problems, projecting his immediate fears onto a grand cosmic canvas. The contrast between the American heat dome and the European crisis is also a critical piece of this puzzle. In the United States, we have built a society fundamentally dependent on artificial cooling. Air conditioning is ubiquitous. It strains the power grid, yes, but it provides a synthetic shield against the extremes of the climate. In Europe, that shield does not exist on a mass scale. The vulnerability is raw and exposed. The European crisis is a glimpse into what happens when the technological buffer is removed, and humanity is forced to face the raw thermal output of a shifting planet. It is a stark reminder that our survival is contingent on fragile infrastructure. And when the temperature pushes past a certain threshold, that infrastructure becomes irrelevant. But there is a crack in that official version, a very specific, undeniable crack. And it starts with a book published in 1961. A scholar named Edgar Leoni published a massive forensic translation and analysis of the prophecies. When Leoni looked at Century 5, Quatrain 98, he did not just read the words as poetry, he analyzed them as coordinates. The text explicitly mentions the 48th climacteric degree. Leoni pointed out that the 48th parallel north is a precise geographic line. It cuts directly across central France and spans continental Europe. It is not a vague region. It is a mathematical coordinate plotted on a map. If you look at a globe, the 48th parallel is the exact dividing line of the European landmass that is currently baking under an unprecedented high-pressure system. It is the bullseye of the current climate anomaly. When Edgar Leoni sat down to translate the text in 1961, he faced a massive challenge. The original French was archaic, filled with anagrams and obscure references, but Quatrain 98 was different. It was unusually direct. Leoni noted that climacteric was a term used to describe a critical period, a turning point. The 48th climacteric degree wasn't just a location, it was a warning that this specific latitude would be the focal point of a critical planetary shift. He recognized that end of Cancer was a precise astrological marker for late July. He did the math. He saw the coordinates. He just didn't live long enough to see the heat dome settle exactly where the text said it would. When you read Stefan Gerson's work, you understand the necessity of skepticism in historical analysis. Gerson is a meticulous scholar. His job is to contextualize, to strip away the myth and find the mundane reality beneath it. He documents how the prophecies were used as propaganda, manipulated by various political factions over the centuries to justify wars, claim divine right, or terrify the populace. His argument is that the texts are essentially empty vessels, mirrors that reflect whatever the reader wants to see. If you are afraid of plague, you see plague. If you are afraid of climate collapse, you see climate collapse. It is a compelling argument, and it is the bedrock of the modern academic consensus. But the academic consensus relies on ignoring the outliers. It relies on smoothing over the data points that refuse to fit the model. Edgar Leoni was not trying to be a mystic. He was trying to be a linguist. He approached the text with the cold, calculating eye of a cryptographer. He understood that while much of the text was indeed vague and symbolic, certain quatrains contained hard data. The 48th climacteric degree is hard data. The end of Cancer is hard data. Bern and Bigorra are hard data. You cannot dismiss hard data as a psychological projection when the hard data aligns perfectly with a recorded historical event centuries later. The academic consensus fails. The mirror theory breaks down because a mirror only reflects what is placed in front of it. It does not predict the specific geographic coordinates of a future thermal anomaly. And then there is the timing. The text does not just say it will be hot. It says this will happen at the end of Cancer. In the astrological calendar, which was the standard method of keeping time for scholars in the 16th century, the end of Cancer corresponds exactly to the end of July, not a random summer day, a precise temporal window. The text gives us a coordinate and it gives us a date on the calendar. Latitude 48, the end of July. This is the moment where the skeptical argument begins to feel inadequate. How do you explain a 400-year-old text pinpointing the exact time and place of a modern meteorological catastrophe? The alignment is too perfect. It is not a broad generalization about war or famine. It is a specific climatic event, pinned to a specific latitude in a specific month. Because of this precision, we have to look at the consequences described in the text. The stanza says, fish in the sea, river, and lake will be boiled hectic. It says Béarn and Bigorre, which are regions in southwestern France, will be in distress through fire from the sky. For centuries, this was the part that made people laugh. Fish boiling in the sea is a ridiculous image. It defies the laws of physics under normal earthly conditions. Oceans regulate their own temperature. But the laughter stops when you read the actual news reports from July of 2026. Temperatures hit 44 degrees Celsius in Spain, Italy, and Greece. That is 111 degrees Fahrenheit. This was not just a hot day. This was a thermal assault, a sustained bombardment of heat that refused to break. The physics of a heat dome are terrifying when you break them down. High pressure from the upper atmosphere acts as a ceiling. As the hot air tries to rise, it is forced back down. The compression heats the air even further. It is a feedback loop of thermal energy, and underneath that dome sits the Mediterranean Sea, a massive, enclosed body of water. Unlike the open ocean, the Mediterranean cannot easily cycle cold water from the deep. It absorbs the heat from the dome above it. That is why the sea surface temperatures spiked past 30 degrees Celsius. That is the exact mechanism that caused the fish to boil, fulfilling a prophecy written by a man who had no concept of atmospheric thermodynamics, yet perfectly described its biological consequence. The heat was so intense that the shallow coastal waters of the Mediterranean Sea began to superheat. Oceanographic measurements confirmed that sea surface temperatures hit record highs, pushing above 30 degrees Celsius. This triggered massive marine heat waves. In shallow waters, when the temperature spikes like that, the oxygen levels plummet. The fish literally suffocated and suffered thermal shock. They washed up on the beaches by the thousands, their bodies breaking down from the extreme heat. The water felt like a hot bath. The sea was, for all practical biological purposes, boiling the life inside it. Just like the printer in lion read on that freshly pressed sheet of paper 4 centuries ago. The hyperbole was not a metaphor. It was an accurate description of marine hypoxia driven by extreme surface temperatures. And what about the fire from the sky? In the summer of 2026, the extreme heat triggered devastating wildfires across southern Europe. Firefighters in France and Italy lost their lives trying to contain infernos that moved faster than any human could run. The air was thick with ash. The sky turned a terrifying shade of orange, blocking out the sun and replacing it with a toxic haze. For the people on the ground, in regions like southwestern France, the very areas mentioned in the text, it absolutely felt like distress through fire from the sky. The physical reality of 2026 perfectly aligned with the supposedly metaphorical language of 1555. The prophecy was acting as a mirror, reflecting the exact physical trauma of the present moment. The sheer vastness of the Mediterranean Sea makes the boiling fish anomaly even more staggering. We are talking about an expanse of water covering over 2.5 million square kilometers. It is a massive heat sink that has regulated the climate of southern Europe and northern Africa for millennia. For a body of water that large to experience a thermal spike so severe that it causes mass biological die-offs in its coastal zones requires an influx of thermal energy that is almost impossible to comprehend. It is not just the surface that heats up. The heat penetrates downward, disrupting the thermocline, the layer of water that separates the warm surface from the cold depths. When the thermocline is disrupted, the entire marine ecosystem begins to collapse. The fish do not just die. The microscopic phytoplankton, the very foundation of the oceanic food web, are decimated. I spend hours in my office staring at the satellite imagery provided by the European Space Agency's Copernicus program. You can see the thermal anomalies in bright, angry colors. The data does not lie. The ground temperatures in parts of Spain exceeded 50 degrees Celsius during the peak of the July event. The soil itself was baking, losing all its moisture, turning arable land into hard, cracked clay. This is the very great dryness mentioned in the text. It is a cascading failure. The heat dries the soil. The dry soil stops evaporating water. The lack of evaporation means no localized cooling, which in turn drives the air temperature even higher. It is a vicious, self-sustaining loop of destruction. But here is where the story turns. The skeptics have a final line of defense. They say that European summers have always been hot. They say this is just a standard natural weather fluctuation. A bad year, sure, but not a structural shift. They claim that connecting this to an ancient text is just confirmation bias, a human attempt to find meaning in random chaos. But the official data completely demolishes that argument. The European Environment Agency, along with Eurostat, maintains the extreme weather and climate mortality reports. Their data shows that 9 of the 10 hottest summers in European recorded history occurred after the year 2010. Let me repeat that. 9 of the 10 hottest summers ever recorded happened in just the last 16 years. This is not a natural fluctuation. This is a terrifying new baseline. It is a fundamental rewriting of the continent's climatological DNA. The data gets even more disturbing when you look at the human cost. We have peer-reviewed epidemiological modeling from the Barcelona Institute for Global Health. A study led by Joan Ballester and published in the journal Nature Medicine analyzed the exact human toll of this heat. They did not just count bodies in morgues. They used daily baseline temperature mortality curves to isolate the specific number of deaths attributable directly to the extreme heat. Their findings were devastating. They estimated that 62,775 deaths were attributable to heat in Europe during a single summer. 62,775 human beings, and over 180,000 cumulative heat deaths in recent summers. Italy, Spain, and Greece had the highest per capita mortality rates. This is not a slight increase in mortality. This is a mass casualty event playing out in slow motion. Joan Ballester and his team at the Barcelona Institute for Global Health understood this mechanism. That is why their Nature Medicine study is so crucial. They did not just look at the raw number of deaths. They looked at the correlation between the temperature anomalies and the excess mortality. They proved that the deaths were not random. They were directly proportional to the intensity and the duration of the heat dome. The study showed that women and the elderly were disproportionately affected. In a society that prides itself on modern medicine and infrastructure, tens of thousands of people were killed by the sheer temperature of the air around them. It is a profound vulnerability that we have tried to engineer our way out of, but the data proves that we have failed. Think about the architecture of cities like Paris, Rome, or Madrid. They were built over centuries, designed specifically to retain heat. Thick stone walls, narrow streets, heavy shutters. This was a brilliant survival strategy for the bitter winters of the Little Ice Age, which ironically peaked shortly after the prophecies were published. But in 2026, that exact same architecture became a death trap. The stone walls absorb the 44-degree heat during the day and radiate it back into the apartments at night. It is a slow, relentless baking process. The European Environment Agency knows this. Their reports highlight that the urban heat island effect amplifies the mortality rates exponentially. The very cities that represent the pinnacle of European civilization have been transformed into thermal ovens. And let us talk about the skeptic's favorite word, hyperbole. When the text mentions distress through fire from the sky, the academic reflex is to dismiss it as dramatic flair. But talk to the rescue teams who deployed to the Gironde region in France or the outskirts of Athens. The extreme heat created its own microclimates. The wildfires generated pyrocumulonimbus clouds, literal fire thunderstorms that shot lightning back down into the dry brush, igniting new fires miles ahead of the main front. It was, in the most literal, physical sense imaginable: fire from the sky. The firefighters were fighting a weather system born of flame. When the text said Bern and Bigorre would be in distress, it wasn't a metaphor for political unrest. It was a precise description of a region being consumed by a meteorological phenomenon that we only just learned how to classify. These numbers are not just statistics. They represent a silent massacre. The skeptics try to argue that heatwave death numbers are inflated. They claim that most victims are frail elderly people who would have died soon anyway. But the epidemiological models prove that this is a lie. Extreme heat directly triggers acute cardiovascular and respiratory collapse in tens of thousands of people who would otherwise have survived. They die in their apartments. Many older European cities have absolutely no air conditioning infrastructure. The buildings were designed to trap heat, to survive cold winters. When the nights stay above 40 degrees Celsius, the human body cannot cool down. Sleep becomes impossible. The heart works harder and harder, pumping blood to the skin to release heat, until it simply stops. This is the reality of the fire from the sky. It is a quiet, suffocating death in a dark room, while the government pretends it is just a particularly warm summer. Let us go back to the exact translation of the text. Poisson en mer, fleuve, la cuit hectique. The word hectique is fascinating. In 16th century French, it derived from the medical term for a consumptive, wasting fever. It implies a relentless, burning heat that consumes from within. It is not a quick boil. It is a slow, agonizing rise in temperature. This is exactly what a marine heat wave is. It does not happen overnight. The solar radiation beats down on the stagnant water for weeks, slowly raising the temperature degree by degree, until the biological limits of the marine organisms are breached. The use of the word hectique demonstrates a terrifyingly precise understanding of the physiological mechanism of thermal death in an aquatic environment. And consider the geographical specificity of Bern and Bigorre. These are historical provinces in the Pyrenees region of southwestern France. They are characterized by their rugged terrain, dense forests, and susceptibility to dry winds. By naming these specific regions, the text is not just throwing darts at a map. It is identifying a highly vulnerable ecological zone that is perfectly positioned to catch the brunt of a massive high-pressure system stalling over the continent. When the wildfires erupted in 2026, they tore through the pine forests of the Gironde and the surrounding areas, mirroring the exact geographic locus of destruction outlined in the stanza. The sheer volume of the data we process today is both a blessing and a curse. In my basement in Springfield, I can pull up real-time telemetry from the Sentinel satellites tracking the exact moisture content of the soil in southern Europe. I can watch the carbon monoxide emissions from the wildfires spike on a global map. I have more information at my fingertips than any emperor or scholar in human history. Yet, with all this technology, with all these satellites and supercomputers modeling the atmosphere, we were still caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the 2026 heat event. We had the data, but we lacked the imagination to understand what the data meant. The author of the text in 1555 lacked the data, but possessed an imagination, or a vision, that perfectly encapsulated the reality of the crisis. The official narrative wants you to believe that progress is linear, that we are constantly moving away from the ignorance of the past toward a brighter, more controlled future. But the climate data tells a different story. It tells a story of cyclical instability. It tells a story of a planet that occasionally reboots its own systems through extreme violence. When we read these ancient texts, we are not reading magic. We are reading the survival records of humanity. We are reading the desperate attempts of our ancestors to codify and transmit their understanding of these massive planetary cycles. They didn't have epidemiological models, so they used the language of astrology and prophecy. But the core warning remains the same. The Earth has a rhythm. And right now, that rhythm is accelerating toward a breaking point. This is why the nature medicine study is the smoking gun of this entire investigation. The researchers did not just rely on official death certificates, because coroners rarely list heat as the primary cause of death. They list heart attacks. They list strokes. They list respiratory failure. Joan Ballister's team bypassed that bureaucratic blindness. They looked at the baseline mortality rate for those specific weeks and compared it to the actual number of bodies being taken to the morgues. The gap between those two numbers, the excess mortality, was 62,775. That is the true body count of the fire from the sky. That is the number of people who were erased by the 48th climacteric degree. This brings us to the core of the investigation. Why do we resist connecting these dots? Stefan Gerson's analysis is the academic standard because it is safe. It is comforting to believe that 16th century texts are just reflections of 16th century problems. If we admit that the text from 1555 accurately described the European heat disaster of 2026, we have to admit that our understanding of time, of causality, and of human perception is fundamentally incomplete. We have to admit that the universe might operate on cycles that are far larger and more terrifying than our daily news feeds can comprehend. We have to confront the possibility that the warning was always there, printed on damp paper in Lion, and we simply refuse to read it. So we are left with a profoundly unsettling reality. We have a text from 1555 that gives us a latitude. It gives us a month. It gives us the exact physical consequences of extreme heat on marine life and human populations. And we have the peer-reviewed epidemiological data from 2026 confirming that this exact scenario has materialized with devastating precision. Over 62,000 dead. The Mediterranean superheating. The forests burning. Was the author of that text seeing the future? Or did he understand a cyclical planetary rhythm, a deep, terrifying pulse of the Earth that we are only now beginning to measure with our satellites and our epidemiological models? Did he tap into a macro cycle of planetary change that our modern science is only just beginning to map out? The official version tells us to ignore the old books. It tells us that the past has nothing to teach us about the future, because our technology has made us immune to the cycles of nature. But the old books knew exactly what was coming. The text was not a metaphor. It was a weather report from a burning continent delivered 5 centuries early. We ignored it because it was easier to believe the sea couldn't boil. We ignored it because it challenged our arrogance, our belief that we had conquered the elements. But the elements have returned, and they are following the exact script laid out in 1555. So, what do we do with this information? We have to stop treating these historical texts as mere curiosities. The database I maintain is not a hobby. It is an early warning system built on the discarded fragments of history. When a 16th century apothecary, a man who survived the plagues of his era, writes down a specific latitude and a specific astrological date, and warns of the sea boiling and fire falling from the sky, and then 4 centuries later, the exact geographic coordinates experience the deadliest, Most unnatural heat event in recorded history, we have to pay attention. We have to stop hiding behind the comforting illusion of coincidence. If you found value in this investigation, if you appreciate the deep dive into the archives and the data that goes beyond the mainstream headlines, I want you to consider using the Super Thanks button below the video. You are not just a viewer. You are an ally in the search for the truth. Your support is what allows me to spend hours crossing these ancient texts with modern data feeds, bringing these forgotten warnings into the light. It is a direct investment in keeping this kind of independent, hard-hitting research alive. Without your support, these connections remain buried in the noise of the 24-hour news cycle. Now, I want to hear from you. Tell me your own experience. Write the word inferno in the comments if you have ever felt that kind of oppressive, suffocating heat, the kind that makes it impossible to sleep and makes you question if the weather is fundamentally broken. Let me know where you are watching from and what the summers are feeling like in your city right now. I read every single comment, and I will see you in the next investigation.